Before we dive straight into the nuts and bolts of how we program Sunset, we're first going to take this opportunity to introduce you to some of the effects and processes that we find ourselves constantly turning to throughout most of our productions. The reason for this is because it's often the processes and the quality that really adds that extra production value to a track. Whereas you can generally say that most plug-in synthesizers produce timbres of good production quality, the same can't be said of plug-in processors and effects. And you find that in most poor productions, it's the effects and the processes that have been the weakest link in the chain. The fact is that the quality of a lot of the cheaper computer-based plug-in processors and effects are seriously overrated and exaggerated. And with music production, unfortunately, you can't subscribe to the theory that it doesn't matter what tools you use, it's what you do with them that counts. Just as it's impossible to knock a 6-inch nail in with a screwdriver or tighten a bolt without a spanner, it's impossible to get those professional results if you rely on nothing more than a collection of poor plug-in processors and effects. I think it's imperative from the very start to understand that your music will only be as good as its weakest link. And in the majority of cases, we've found that the difficulty musicians experience in attaining that professional quality sound has mostly been down to an incredibly poor collection of tools. They just seem so oblivious to the fact that the quality of your tools will have an overruling influence on the sound that's going to come from your monitors. Of course, we understand that the high-end professional plug-in effects and processors are expensive, but then if you want to attain that professional sound, you have to use professional processors. There's just no other way around it. This is why, for the next few minutes or so, we're going to introduce you to a few plugins that we find ourselves turning to time and time again. These are processors that we trust to produce the professional results. Of course, we just don't have the time or the room to list every single processor we have or use. So what we're going to do is going to just touch upon the ones that we use on every production we do. The first series of plugins are the Sound Performance Labs processors. This consists of the Transient Designer, the Rangers, and the Twin Tube. If you've been producing music seriously for any amount of time, you probably have heard of the SPL and most probably the Transient Designers out of all of these. But the principle behind a Transient Designer is really, really simple. It permits you to shape the attack and sustain characteristics of any timbre. Now, using these two buttons here, the attack and sustain parameters of any timbre can be amplified or attenuated using this. Now, since we determine an incredible amount of information from the transient of any particular timbre, you can probably understand how this type of dynamic manipulation is absolutely fundamental to writing any sort of music. Now, we tend to use this on every single channel within any production. We not only shape timbres with it, we use it to push sounds around the mix as well, because by reducing the attack stage, the timbre can appear to move backwards towards the rear of a mix. Now, we already have 4 of these in hardware, and this in software is just phenomenal. Now, the EQ ranges, which you can see here, these are based on the EQ modules from the SPL rack packs. Essentially, these are known as graphic EQs, but the proper term is a passive filter. As you can see here, you have the bass ranger, the Vox ranger, and the full ranger. Obviously, they're fairly self-descriptive here. The bass ranger and Vox ranger specialise in specific frequency bands, but we often use them outside these ranges. For example, the bass ranger, we use that quite a bit actually on kicks, and of course the full ranger does what it says on the tin. It's a set of filter bands that covers the whole frequency range. Now, I don't think these should be underestimated. With so many paragraphic and parametric EQs available, it's easy to become too overcritical, and I find it becomes more of a surgical procedure than a creative one. Obviously, we don't use these for a mix, but for creative timbre programming, they really do the job, and we'll often use these 10 or more times within a single project to really nail down the timbre and make sure it sits within the frequency range we feel it should sit in. And finally, we have the twin tube, which you can see here. Again, this comes from the Analog Hardware Rack Pack and is a tube emulation plugin. It allows you to apply both tube harmonics and saturation to the audio. This is absolutely fantastic for adding that extra warmth to a sound, and we tend to use this an awful lot, especially on the end bus of a mix. Next up, we have the Flux plugins. These seem to be something of a secret because not many home producers seem to have heard of these, but I can't think of any engineers that I know that haven't used them. These truly are a professional set of plugins with a sound quality that is just absolutely spot on. The pack altogether consists of around 7 or 8 plugins, each which performs a very specific function. For example, the Pure Expander here accomplishes just about everything to do with expansion, from very subtle effects to just incredibly extreme. It's the same here with this Pure De-Expander. This can just enhance the low levels of timbres, or if you turn it to the extreme, it makes timbres appear more compacted. Obviously here, the Pure compressor is a compressor that, if you push it really heavily, it can produce a lovely pumping sound on a mix. It's not quite as good as the SSL compressor if you put the SSL compressor on the end of a mix to get that warm sound that everyone expects to hear. But for individual timbres, it can really work some magic. ePure is basically an incredibly efficient and transparent EQ. We use this quite a bit, especially when we come to the pre-mix stage where we want to clean up some instruments. We use this because it's incredibly quiet. These, basically the Solera 2, Pure Limiter and Alchemist, are mostly designed for mastering. I'm not going to bore you with too many details concerning these because we will cover these thoroughly in the mastering stage, but all I will say for the moment is that these are the tools to turn to when you're mastering, especially Alchemist. You see, it's a 5-band dynamic processor, but each band has its own compressor, expander, decompressor and de-expander, along with a transient processor and an MS controller. Next we have the sound toys. Now, I don't think I'll need to introduce this to many of you, but we're going to mention them just in case you've been living on Mars for the past few years. If you need delay or echo, you turn to Echo Boy. It's that simple because nothing else on the planet sounds like this does. Of course, there are more plugins here in the pack, as you can see, but we've yet to produce a mix where we haven't used Echo Boy. This really is the ultimate in echo. And I've no doubt that as we start to get on with this production, we'll be using this and you'll be able to hear for yourself just how good this is. Of course, as I mentioned, there are other plugins such as the Filter Freak 1 and Filter Freak 2. We turn to these now and again throughout our productions, but I must admit nowhere is near as much as Echo Boy. Having said that, these are an excellent set of filter plugins, and we especially like the ability that you can set the filter frequency movements to an LFO, which we do tend to use now and again in a mix just to add that extra interest to a timbre. Finally, we have the tremolator, the phase mistress and the crystallizer. These are probably our least used from the collection. We've used them on a few remixes to warp the original parts, but we certainly don't use them as much as the Echo Boy, and I think we mostly bought this pack just for the Echo Boy. But the other plugins, fantastic sound quality, and they could be perfect for what you do if you like to manipulate your timbres a little bit more. Now, when I was speaking about the Flux plugins and mentioned that they were pretty much the only plugins we use for mastering, I said pretty much because we also tend to turn to the BX Digital and BX Control quite a bit. The BX Digital, as you can see here, is probably the final word in mastering EQ. 5-band EQ, de-esser, mono maker, bass and presence shifters. It's also got mid-side mastering mode. This is pretty much essential when mastering today, and with the EQ, it's just sheer transparency on it. So this tends to not only be our go-to when mastering, but if we're after a slightly different EQ during production, we tend to turn to this. We also rely incredibly heavily on this as well, the BX Control. This is basically a level meter which helps you keep track of the peak and RMS levels. But it also has a mono maker here to check your mix in mono and stereo with controls, so you can add that extra depth to a mix. As I mentioned at the very beginning, there's a number of other plugins we could mention, but these are the ones that we find ourselves turning to most of the time. In fact, I suspect as we start to produce this track, you'll see just how much we actually rely on these plugins as we go through programming the track. So on that note, we'll get down, we'll move on, and we'll get some ideas down.